useful to different groups and audiences, and also even within sense, the range of people's abilities in that group. So we've done a lot of training with people who were deaf and blind, but actually I think we only had one person who was.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for spending so much of your brain time thinking these things through. If we listen now, and we'll know where to go next.
Okay, our table, we focus mainly on growing the role of stroke ambassadors, what can help them more, what can help them develop further, what might they want to see. So having Maureen here was fantastic. She, one of the initial things she mentioned was communication, just making sure it's very clear exactly where they have to be, when they have to be there, that kind of thing, streamlining that, making sure that's all working really clearly. That's the kind of practical side of things. And then earlier on we heard about maybe achievements, recognising and giving certificates perhaps. Maureen said she's not fussed by that, but others are. So it's important that there are differences and to allow that, so everybody, whatever their requirements, they do get access to these things that might give them more impetus to keep going. So some sort of certificate, maybe after a certain number of sessions they've helped facilitate, they could get some sort of certificate. We also talked about on the ward itself, if the ambassadors are going into the stroke unit, having a photograph of them up on the wall saying stroke ambassador. It could be a really good way to raise awareness for the staff in the hospital. The stroke ambassadors, when they go in, they see this as a kind of consolidation of what they're doing, and then the other stroke survivors in the ward or other neurological patients are seeing this, and it's building awareness of what's going on. You could extend that and have other, but that would be nice. And we've also talked about tracking things, so maybe the website's already been built. Could we have a peer ambassador section where there's a private forum, so in between these monthly sessions where the ambassadors get together, could they, if they've got access to the internet, they could go on there in a safe space and talk through any ideas and support one another. Maybe it's already set up. Okay, it's already there, so let's make use of that and help explore it more and make it easier, perhaps.
Just for all, there is a Stroke Odysseys South London Facebook group, which people said was the easiest for everybody to access.
Okay, brilliant. So
I know that Gareth uses it, and Leslie and Marek, but not everybody's on Facebook, and not everybody uses the computer. But it was the easiest forum at the time, so I'm sorry, we'll have to think of another one if it doesn't work.
We also mentioned briefly the idea, in Maureen's case, me and Melanie today have been just amazed by the way that Maureen's voice seems to be so open and more clear and all this. So we talked about maybe an audio diary or something. Is there a way we could facilitate stroke ambassadors to track their own progress in various ways on a timeline, so they can look back, where was I last year and where am I now? Is there a way that they can maybe track that? Is there anything I've missed?
Staff training.
Oh, staff training, yeah. So I guess that plays into everything Stroke Odysseys is doing, but is there a way staff can be really aware that these stroke ambassadors are involved and to educate them in what those areas?
But that's staff training or nursing staff? Nursing.
And that kind of led on to a conversation about your creative process and practice, and kind of consolidating that, how you might do that, and then so you could roll it out a bit further, so there could be a resource created, an online films or downloadable resource that staff could use after, if the funding runs out and staff feel that it's useful.
So I asked Maureen whether she ever felt awkward in sessions if she couldn't lead a workshop exercise, because some people do and some people don't. Titus led a breathing and Lil, I think, has led an exercise in my experience, and Maureen would find that uncomfortable, or maybe we could find an exercise that you could lead. Maybe that should be talked about, what Maureen could lead. But anyway, we thought that, from my point of view, just having a stroke ambassador or two in the group who are familiar with the exercises that we do is fantastically valuable, and probably I haven't said that to these stroke ambassadors present, but I hope that they're aware of that. But the fact that they are familiar with the exercise and they don't find it difficult to just pass a sound around a circle or follow a movement exercise, the fact that they are familiar with those exercises is fantastically useful, I think. So if they don't want to lead an exercise, they don't have to, shouldn't feel uncomfortable, they shouldn't feel redundant.
Gary.
Feeding on from Melanie, there is another thing. You can demonstrate with a stroke ambassador the technique you're going to do in an exercise, so it demonstrates to the other stroke survivors that they can do something.
Who's going to finish this? I mean, we just said building this resource kind of for downloadable materials to help practitioners and their staff, perhaps if they view it. We talked about maybe animations as well. Simple animations can get a message and an idea of an exercise across really, really well. So that's something that's worth considering.
And maybe the alert for when the next session is, the date and the time. Maybe that could be something very particular online. Maybe we can find an alternative to Facebook or a message or something like that. So you've got a very clear, you know exactly the time and the hospital and the date. So,
yes.
So we need to improve that.
Liz.
We divided our time.
Can you take the mic, please?
Oh,
That's right.
we divided our time 10 minutes on each of the 3 topics, so we sort of skated along the surface a bit. Carrying on from where you were talking about stroke ambassadors, we focused actually on this question of what happens to people at the end of a series of workshops, and we were talking about, Gareth was talking about aphasia now,
Aphasia Reconnect.
Aphasia Reconnect, which is a group that runs a drop-in. As an example of other activities that are happening within the stroke community, of which the Stroke Odysseys project is one, but there are others. And we were talking about whether Stroke Odysseys should have its act together, if you like, in relation to what else is happening out there, not only as we begin our project, but through it and following on at the end. And Sarah introduced the idea of the Stroke Association, which is out there and in communities, as perhaps a way of being an administrative connector between projects, so that one gets to a point at the end of our project where if Stroke Odysseys itself can't offer something going forward, a person doesn't feel that they can be a peer ambassador for whatever reason it might be, that we have a raft of other possibilities available for people that maybe in some way we've connected into. So thinking on my feet now as I'm talking this back, that at the sharings at the end of a session, that maybe key people from those other groups that are functioning in the areas should also perhaps be invited to those performances. So we talked about that a bit. Anything else that I've missed on that strand? No? The other strand we talked about was the research question, and Mark was describing to us how really you need 40 to 50 people participating in every strand of the research, and how, as I understood it, we talked about there being 2 research groups, one mirroring the other. So you've got one lot which is looking at people who are involved, and then another lot who is looking at people who aren't involved, and then seeing the difference between the 2 groups. We talked about the difference between how you monitor within a hospital and how you monitor within a community, and talked about how within the community that self-monitoring was perhaps the safest and most efficacious way of doing the monitoring. In other words, that you don't have external yardsticks by how much more I can move my leg or how many words I can say, but it's actually the person themselves describing and noticing for themselves what feels different, whether they can see their own goals achieved and reached within a set period of time, but how that wasn't going to work within a hospital. And that maybe within the hospital setting, one had to have another person who was a monitor, whether it was an OT, or whether it was a carer, or whether it was a family member, or somebody who was regularly involved with that person's progress. So, anything else? Does that cover it well?
No, I think it's summed up really well, actually. Yeah, just
Final thing we glanced at was this question of performance and the concern and worry about how you bring whatever it is together to the moment of performance and how that gets managed and facilitated. Listening in the tea break to Pedro and Melanie talking about how important it can be, could be, should be, we should get, growing onto our toolkit, a sort of Meccano set, if you like, of how we do this work. Because otherwise it feels very frightening, actually. I think I can honestly say that as a facilitator, frightening. That you're kind of in a kind of whirlpool of possibilities and feel you could get sucked under at any minute. That we've had within our toolkit a sort of model that you've got 6 weeks and 6 weeks, and within 6 weeks you're gathering stuff, and within 6 weeks you're shaping it to perform. I think my experience has been that doesn't quite work. And that what I wanted to introduce and suggest was that the idea of how you are eventually going to polish, refine a little something, whatever it is, in order for it to be presented, is actually embedded within the practice right from the very beginning of the workshop. That there isn't a kind of step, there isn't a moment where it starts to be different, but that you're beginning to do that from day one. I haven't quite done that within these Camden workshops, but as I'm getting to the end, I'm thinking, I wish we had approached it in that way. And then we talked about the, how you manage this question which faced us all at the pit. It's not new to us. Who's going to direct it? We've got to have a director. We've got to have the person who's going to pull it all together. But the decision maker, the person who says, well, I think it would be best if we did this, and this within. And then how delicately that has to be placed within the group and the work that we're doing in stroke odysseys, because it's not about a director, it's about coming up from under with everybody's contributions, and yet at the same time there has to be direction. So this is a real kind of it's a real balancing act, and I think requires huge skill actually, and knowledge and depth of experience in this area. So when we're thinking about rolling the project out and going forward, how we find our facilitators, where we draw those people from, is something that we really need to consider. And Helen came up with the gem of the afternoon, I think, which is that the show or the sharing or the performance is a mirror of what the group has achieved together. That's kind of what it should be.
Should write that up.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it?
Melanie, I saw you nodding. Do you want to say anything back about the idea of performance from the beginning?
Yeah, I think it's really critical, and it's what I was harking back to what I said before about the nature of devised work. I think on day one you have a group of people, and from that point on you start noticing because the act of creating, devising work is just noticing things and nurturing things and framing it, you know. So, for instance, Christina, the first time I met her and she walked across the circle, you could tell that she had amazing movement, you know, even though she could barely walk at that point. And so you notice that, and then you start finding points from the very first session. Every subsequent session, you find opportunities to bring out those aspects of people, those skills, which often they don't know themselves that they have. Actually, we all have idiosyncrasies, you know, which are wonderful to present, that we don't realise that some of them are to do with our inability. So Maureen doing that at the end of the session, you know, our project around the corner was incredible, you know. And if I'd have done that, it would have been idiotic. But you know, do you know what I mean? It made sense. You doing it was incredibly poignant and powerful. So I think it's noticing those moments. I agree. I think sort of 6 weeks of exercises and then putting together.
I think that's the 6 weeks of exercises and 6 weeks of shaping is fairly arbitrary. It just helped to describe a process where, I mean, it's not exercises, it's kind of developing confidence. For me though, what I wanted to add into that is I think if from day one you're performing, then from day one you're establishing a difference of power. When we're learning movement and improvisation together, it builds confidence, so there never is that role of director.
I don't think there's conflict.
I
don't think there's conflict, because I think shaping stuff up, sure, you do that quite late on, probably week 10 or week 11, to be honest. But the whole of the rest.
I think we nurture fragments from the beginning, but I think that if you instill from the beginning a director,
No, I didn't mean that. I mean,
it's about nurturing from the beginning, noticing,
yeah,
but keeping that structure of improvised, devising.
and that's why the talking between sessions with the people involved is really critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
I almost think you're already doing that. When I'm working with Lucinda, there's quite often small performances which happen throughout the session actually. So maybe it is already happening. Maybe we just want to embellish on that a bit more.
I think that it's because we've devised a way of working in the hospitals where we're performing quite regularly within the sessions. I'm aware of time.
Okay.
3 minutes, is that right?
No, 3 minutes.
Thank you. Well, not surprisingly, we covered a lot of the same ground, addressed the same questions. I hope these are complementary to what you've discussed. We too started with the ambassadors and their role, and wondered whether the role could be further refined in terms of our description of it, exactly what skills it might encompass, exactly how these might develop from one stage, whether you see it as a level or. While you were all talking, I was thinking it's more like my cub badges. It's more like it's on a level like this. You're an observer, you're an advocate, you're a facilitator, you're a modeler. So it doesn't have to be like this, but it could nonetheless be cumulative in some sense. So we thought this might also help with the research function, trying to specify outcomes. If you said, here's my goal, I am going to become a good modeler, or I am going to notice things that the tutor isn't noticing because I can notice it, or I'm going to be we talked about, we use different terms, but something like the interpreter or the advocate for the patient. Anyway, if we had these precise skills, it might help in the research process or in the business of trying to ascertain what exactly the outcomes were, how successful the whole thing was. So we touched on the idea of accreditation too. I mean, that's the big A word, but there may be forms of accreditation in due course that would be appropriate for those who wanted it. And I think Jawad was quite pro the idea of having an acknowledgement of what had been achieved. So that's another possibility. It doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be a necessary thing, but it might be an addition. And then on performance, there were a couple of things. First, well, I'll do it in the order in which we talked about them, and this I described as possibly heretical when we talked about it. It could be a heretical idea, but it seemed interesting as just a provocation, which would be that although it seems essential to the project, it is essential to the project, and it's produced amazing work, that it's a personal story on the part of the participants that is based in personal experience. We could examine the idea of repertoire. You've got some wonderful material, you've got some wonderful songs. It might be worth thinking of, is this a way of both it's dealing with scale to some extent, and possibly the making of partners further out from the centre, if you like. So it's perfectly possible, I think, that you could have a script, a working structure. You could have some songs, you could have music that's, learnable. You've got choirs out there in the wider community and in the country. So just the notion that when you've produced this piece, it's not the end because you've got to make a completely new piece based on someone else's experience. Chris quickly came up with the kind of chapter headings you already use, if you like, the beginning, the event, the bombshell, the explosion, blah, 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 yeah. the resolution or whatever. So Chris has the exact titles and I can't remember, but clearly there are stages which are common to many, if not most people who've experienced stroke, general events, stages in the tragedy of stroke and also the recovery from stroke, finding a new me, rediscovering myself, what I'm becoming, remembering who I am. These are the words that have been used throughout the project. So the notion of repertoire was just a sort of a way of making the performance not the end in a certain sense. And of course there could be improvised elements, or there could be ways in which the structure allowed people to bring in their own experience, add their own words, make their own movement sequence, but you had some kind of structure. I would just add that I'm personally not against the idea of a director. I think I take your point, but in some way or another, someone who's a facilitating director, but who carries the can in terms of judgment, but is equally able to listen, is a key function. It just makes life very hard if you don't let the buck stop with someone, but they have to be good. I have a director friend who describes himself not as a facilitator, but as a